All right, we're recording. All right, so hello everyone. Today we are joined by Thom Hartmann, who is a progressive, nationally and internationally syndicated talk show host. Talkers Magazine named him America's #1 most important progressive host and the host of one of the top 10 talk show radio shows in the country for every year for more than a decade. He is a 4-time recipient of the Project Censored Award. Hartmann is also a New York Times bestselling author of more than 30 books, which have all been translated into multiple languages. Today, we're here to discuss the book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, How Reaganism Gutted America and How to Restore Its Greatness. This is a book about how America is at a crossroads right now regarding its economic future, and it describes in detail how and why neoliberalism became so prevalent in the US and why it's time for us to turn our backs to it. It's certainly a pleasure to have him here today with GCAS, considering that GCAS is an institution who dedicates itself to replacing the neoliberal model found today in higher education. So, Thom, thank you very much for being here.
That's my pleasure, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me.
So for starters, if you can, give us all a brief overview of how you look at neoliberalism now, sort of past the Reagan era, what it means for us today, and why we should all be concerned.
Yeah, neoliberalism is an economic and ultimately political philosophy that came out of the Great Depression and World War II. It was started by a group of economists who got together first in the 30s, but then seriously reorganized in the 40s under the banner of the Mont Pelerin Society. And their goal, Hayek, Mises, Friedman, their goal was to figure out a way to prevent democracies from doing what had just happened in the world in their lifetimes, either becoming communist like Russia had or the Soviet Union, or becoming fascist like Italy and Germany had done. And being economists, they assumed that economics was the answer to everything. And so they came up with this theory that because in the marketplace, at any given moment, there are literally millions of decisions being made. As we speak right now, Andrew, you and I, someplace somebody is deciding which brand of orange juice to buy or which brand of blue jeans to purchase, or how much to pay for a house or whatever. There's literally millions of economic decisions constantly being made. And therefore, in their minds, the marketplace had its own wisdom, its own intelligence, its own, statistical collection, as it were, of knowledge that could never be equaled by a bureaucrat or a politician. And so, the solution was basically to turn the economy over to the wealthiest and most powerful in the economy, because they were the obvious winners. They were the obvious ones who had figured out how an economy should work. Turn the country over to the rich people, basically, and the big corporations, and radically diminish the role of government, which is always going to be viewed as a lumbering beast. Radically reduce that role of government by cutting taxes on the wealthy, cutting taxes on corporations, reducing regulation on corporations, destroying all the things that work as that could have a tendency to distort normal markets. For example, labor unions, minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare. They view all these things as distortions of the marketplace and therefore as fundamental economic and therefore political evils. So the neoliberal movement was one, based very much in that set of assumptions and following that agenda, in addition to the idea that labor should not be protected by governments either, that corporations and capitalists, industrialists should be free to seek the cheapest labor anywhere in the world, and to hell with national boundaries and labor unions and all that sort of thing.
Okay. I'm curious then what you think might be some remedies then for today's, not only in the US, but today's economic sort of world, I guess. If we look at the Russia-Ukraine crisis and how it's shaping and reshaping the markets all over in Europe now, things have changed quite dramatically in the past few months. Sort of what you think are some things to implement economically that could sort of shift the tide in the people's favor, let's put it that way.
I think it's really important, first of all, because you mentioned Russia and Ukraine, to realize that that situation is the outcome of neoliberalism. When Gorbachev started opening up the Soviet Union, his idea was to produce literally Sweden in Russia. He wanted to model the new Russia after Sweden. He said so. I mean, he used those words. And he wanted a strong welfare state, and he also wanted economic protectionism. He wanted the American plan, Alexander Hamilton's American plan, economically, and then politically and socially. He wanted a Sweden-style social democracy and welfare system. And at that point in time, in the late 80s, early 90s, the International Monetary Fund, which is where he had to go hat in hand for billions in loans in order to make the transition out of communism and into a free market, they were totally bought into the idea of neoliberalism. And so basically they told him, and ultimately it was Yeltsin that they told, and then after Yeltsin, Putin, that you're going to have to accept shock therapy. You're going to have to accept these neoliberal reforms. You're going to radically cut taxes on rich people. You're going to fight off the labor unions and prevent them from having any consequential say in things. You're going to have to allow direct foreign investment. And you're going to have to privatize everything in the country. And keep in mind that 100% of the Soviet economy was government run. And so to go from 100% government run to like 3% government run was a major change. And so in the process of basically selling off everything the government owned through this shock therapy, Russia ended up with a handful, with a few hundred, or arguably a little over 1,000, very mind-bogglingly wealthy individuals who were able to buy up all the stuff that was for sale. For example, if you lived in an apartment in Russia pre this era, that was your apartment. You pass it on to your children, even though the government owned it. But when they started the neoliberal reforms, you got a voucher that was, the value of your apartment. And then you had these oligarchs who would come around and buy up these vouchers until they owned basically the whole building. And, this is how they built these vast fortunes in Russia. This was true of every industry. All the workers were given vouchers for a little piece of the ownership of the companies for which they worked. And again, the oligarchs just bought that up. So that oligarchy then led to, strongman oligarchy, which oligarchy almost always does. Oligarchy is one of the least stable forms of government. I wrote another book about this, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy. And it's almost always a transitional state from, oligarchy into a progressive liberal democracy, which is what we saw in the 1930s here in the United States, or from oligarchy into neoliberal dictatorship, essentially, which is what we saw in Russia. So, the Putin being, strongman that he is and wanting to steal the riches of Ukraine was a logical outcome of neoliberalism. It has never succeeded in producing anything other than oligarchy in any country in the world where it's been tried. The way to get out of neoliberalism in the United States is again, to reverse the neoliberal policies that Reagan put into place in 1981 when he declared the end of the New Deal era and the beginning of the neoliberal era. And that is to re-empower labor unions, to raise taxes on very, very wealthy people and corporations. The average billionaire pays about 3% in taxes, which is far less than the average school janitor pays. And re-regulate business again, so that businesses have to, at the very least, operate in ways that are not inconsistent with the public good. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
No, it does. It's a good segue to a part of your book that describes sort of going back to how the forefathers of the United States looked at their theory of the economy, and especially you give credence to Hamilton's 11-step plan. Now, without going into that so much, I guess the viewers can look it up if they're interested. How can we use that sort of theory, that outlook on economics, while also acknowledging that a big portion of the economy at that point was based on the fact that we had slavery at the time? So yeah, how do we juggle that or reconcile that sort of inherent problem?
Well, you had slavery in the South. The North certainly benefited from it in some sectors, but the North was industrializing, this was pre-industrial revolution, arguably, but the North was growing just fine. Thank you very much. I don't think that the presence or absence of slavery or cheap labor is necessarily part of a company. Is necessary for a country to grow. In fact, I would argue the exact opposite. I would say that the history of America demonstrates the exact opposite. During the time that the cost of labor was highest in this country, which was the era from 1930 to 1980, we had the fastest growing middle class in America. We had the fastest industrial expansion in the world. We had the fastest growth of the middle class. We had never had a middle class that was more than 10% of the population prior to 1933. And by 1981, when Reagan came into office, it was 65% of America. It had never happened before in the world, because the resting state of capitalism is, and you can see this literally in 1,000 years of history, the resting state of capitalism is that the top 1% controls well over 95% of all the wealth and power and political power in the country. The middle class is basically the professional class, the doctors, the lawyers, and the shopkeepers and small businesses like Scrooge in A Christmas Carol by Dickens. He owned a little two-man company. That's the middle class, and that's typically fewer than 5% of the population. And then you've got 95% of the population that is the working poor. That's the norm in a purely laissez-faire, unregulated, libertarian or neoliberal capitalist society. And what Alexander Hamilton proposed was that government interfere in that marketplace in a big way, so that by putting tariffs on imported goods, we would encourage the domestic manufacture of goods, so that we would start building an industrial capacity. By reducing tariffs on exports and even subsidizing exports, we would find new markets for goods that we had manufactured, which would further speed up the growth of our industrial economy. By giving incentives, whether they were tax incentives or even grants, to new industries that we felt were really important to have in the United States. These were all parts of Hamilton's, he called it the American Plan. You would build industry in America, and it's what happened. It wasn't slavery that built America. There were a lot of slaves who built America. But it was Hamilton's 11-point plan that built America, that made America the great industrial power that it was. And it was the abandonment of that in 1981 by Reagan, and doing away with the tariff system and doing away with everything that I just described, basically, and just going to a neoliberal system where big companies can find the cheapest labor in the world, and to hell with American workers, and they can manufacture offshore, and all the prosperity associated with that manufacturing belongs to that country where they're doing the manufacturing. We made China rich this way, right? Instead of our middle class growing since 1980, it's been shrinking. It was 65% of America in 1981 when Reagan came into office. It's 45% of America now. Meanwhile, China's middle class is now larger than the entire population of the United States. And China's middle class was fewer than 2% of its population in 1980. So, and all they did, they explicitly, intentionally adopted Hamilton's plan. I mean, they had this big debate when I was in China in 1980, and I lived there for a month in November of 1988. And they were literally, Joe and Lai, they were literally having, or not Joe, I'm forgetting his name now, but the Chinese premier, they were literally having this debate about, should we go neoliberal like Russia is, or should we, and Chile had done, or should we go, and the United States had adopted with Reaganism, or should we adopt Alexander Hamilton's American plan that had been adopted by Japan and South Korea? And they ultimately decided that they would go with the American plan, the Chinese. So, did that answer your question?
There's a lot of content in there, so I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I guess then now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the modern sort of technological society, the power that technology and the business technology has, technological businesses have over, the economic sector, let's say. Mm-hmm. So the question really is, we see these big, massive companies, and they're working in this neoliberal model. But a lot of them sort of talk about the sort of social corporatocracy sort of thing, where everyone gets sort of the same things and we're all sort of in the same boat together and they can control stuff. The World Economic Forum also has rhetoric a bit like this. And it seems that, if that is the trajectory of the future, well, the very, very rich will still be able to control things unregulated at all, but we'll all have this sort of socialism, and not socialism in the nice sense. It's sort of where we just get what we can to scrape by. I'm curious about your thoughts on that sort of outlook of the future.
Well, you're describing the world under neoliberalism, or America under neoliberalism. And I think that, we've had this 40-year experiment. Reagan introduced this, Bill Clinton bought into it, signed NAFTA, declared the end of the era of big government and the end of welfare as we know it. Bush continued it with a massive tax cut for billionaires and big corporations. Obama continued it after Bush, with Obamacare, which basically hands all, billions, trillions of dollars of government money to giant for-profit health insurance companies. And of course, Donald Trump tripled down on it with his $2 trillion tax cut and more deregulation of companies. What I'm seeing right now in the Biden administration and the Democratic Party in general, and frankly, I think across the American electorate, is that we're sick and tired of this failed 40-year experiment. It has gutted the American middle class. It's harmed our national health and wealth. In Wealth of Nations back in 1776, Adam Smith pointed out that manufacturing is how nations become rich. Period. That if you have a tree limb laying on the ground, it has no intrinsic value outside of what nature may ascribe to it. But if you carve that, if you apply human labor to it and carve it into an axe handle, you have something that has value, and it'll have value for generations. In other words, manufacturing produces wealth. And by exporting our manufacturing from the 80s until today, so that the vast majority of goods that are sold in the United States today are no longer made in the United States, by exporting our manufacturing, what we did is we impoverished ourselves. We transferred our wealth to mostly China. China went from being a dirt poor country to being, next year they're going to be the wealthiest country in the world. Their middle class is larger than the entire population of the United States. So that, as I think I may have mentioned. So this is, the great debate that's going on in America right now. And, people aren't talking about it explicitly in the terms that I am, but this is really the great debate. Do we continue down this neoliberal road and diminish the value and power of labor and continue to increase the power of billionaires? You got 3 people now who own more wealth than the bottom half of America. Do we continue down that road? Or do we return to progressive policies like Franklin Roosevelt started with the New Deal that actually enhance the wealth of the middle class, strengthen the political power of the middle class, and slightly reduce the wealth and power of the top 1% and the giant corporations, and break up some of those corporations so that competition can return to the American economy? I think if we fail to do that, and I think I built a pretty strong argument for it in this book, if we fail to do that, we're really going to be in trouble.
Okay, thanks. This is maybe a question a bit out of left field, but you had the farmer versus hunter hypothesis, which helped in the study of ADHD, I believe. I wonder if, using that type of insight, can you see something similar in people who are leaning more towards neoliberalism? It doesn't have to be specific to the hunter-farmer hypothesis, but do you see something in the psychology of people, the evolutionary perhaps psychology of people, that lean more towards neoliberalism, and the people who lean more towards, let's say, progressive, perhaps egalitarian type policies? Is there something in there actually that maybe gets the gears going for you?
Well, one of the core tenets of neoliberalism is a social tenet, which is very rarely discussed by neoliberals, but is, Hayek and Mises and Friedman were very, very clear about. And that's the idea that there are classes and orders in society and norms in society, and that's a good thing, that those are the result of thousands of years of societal evolution, and that we should not change society rapidly within 1 or 2 generations. The idea that women, for example, should have rights outside of the bedroom and the kitchen was an idea that the fathers of neoliberalism thought was crazy. that women had been under the thumbs of men for thousands of years. They should continue under the thumbs of men. The same with minorities, under the thumbs of white people. The same with gay people. They should just stay in the closet. I mean, these were explicit policies of neoliberalism. And when Pinochet took over Chile, he put them into law. When Putin took over Russia, he put them into law. When Iraq went neoliberal, it was those kinds of things were put into law by and large. And you've got right wingers in America who are trying to put them into law right now. And you see again, putting women back in the kitchen and the bedroom with, by banning abortion, for example, and disempowering women, trying to take away birth control so that women don't have, the ability to compete with men in the workplace. So there is a particular mindset that loves the idea that white men should control everything, and that's mostly white men. Whether that confers any kind of evolutionary advantage, like I think the ADHD gene does or not, is a whole separate argument. But I do think that there's a natural audience for neoliberalism, which is in every country. And that's the overclass, as it were, the group that perceives themselves to be the ones who are superior to everybody else, and they control the majority of the wealth and the power.
Okay, so I think our time's running out a little bit. Maybe we have time for one more question, I suppose.
Sure.
And that is about higher education in the United States. So everyone knows the state of higher education in the U.S. It's incredibly expensive, and sometimes it's even working for the purposes of neoliberalism. It's very hard to find, institutions sometimes that are teaching alternative sources of history. So Georgism is something that comes to mind. What do you think about how higher education itself functions, and not so much the people who institute neoliberal policies in the government, but higher education itself functions in the United States as, sort of something that perpetuates the neoliberal model for the benefit of itself, the universities?
Well, first of all, everybody should read Henry George. That said, when Reagan instituted neoliberal reforms in education, he cut back, for example, they abandoned federal funding for civics education. They reduced federal funding for gifted learners. And over the years since then, they've done everything they can to cut back funding of public education. When Reagan came into office, pretty much anywhere in the country, you could go to college working a part-time job. In 1967, 68, I went to college. And I put myself through school. I was living on my own at the time. I paid my rent, I paid my tuition, I bought my books, pumping gas at a gas station, an Esso station, and washing dishes at Bob's Big Boy. You could do that back then. Neoliberalism teaches that the subsidy, and that was because 80% of the cost of college was paid for by state and federal governments. And neoliberalism teaches that state and local governments should have no involvement in education. It should be entirely up to the individual. And if that turns out to be a society where only wealthy, the children of wealth can go to college, that's fine, because there's something Darwinian about that. That's a good thing. And so what we've seen now is we've gone from 80% of the college costs being covered by government in 1981, when Reagan came into office, to a little less than 20% today. And the balance of it, of course, is paid for by tuition. And so in stepped to exploit that situation, in stepped the banking industry with their student loans. And after they got, Congress to make it illegal to discharge student debt in bankruptcy, they just leaped into this thing. And so now we've got a student loan crisis as well. These are all the products of neoliberal policy, and neoliberals are quite proud of these. In fact, there are neoliberals arguing today that 20% support of education is too much, and that all public schools should be privatized and just have charter schools, and states, if they are going to subsidize education at all, they should do it through voucher systems. In addition, the stratification of society that comes about as a consequence of having to go deeply in debt to go to college, or only being able to go to college if you come from a wealthy family, that again enhances that neoliberal notion that Darwinian evolutionary notion that the strong are the strongest because, evolution intended them to be, the rich are the richest because evolution intended them to be. It's kind of a neo-Calvinism in a way. John Calvin, well, his followers anyway, argued that riches are proof of God's blessing, and therefore the rich people should rule. Betsy DeVos is a Calvinist. It shouldn't surprise us that she holds the position she does. So, I see neoliberalism and in particular higher education well entangled right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering all these questions.
Question, I'd be glad to take a shot at it.
Excuse me?
If you have another question, I'd be glad to take a shot at it.
Well, let's see here. I can look through. I guess there was one question in mind because I know you're busy and you have a schedule to uphold, and it's simple. So when I imagine the answer to this question, I think I know the answer, but it's a simple yes or no question. And it seems millennials now really struggle to prove to the generations above that life is quite difficult, and perhaps more difficult than it was in the past from, let's say, the baby boomer period on. And do you think that's true?
I don't know if it's more of a challenge to convince people of the crisis the millennials are facing, but the millennials are facing a crisis. They are the generation, and the Zoomers now are the generation that have inherited the whirlwind of Reagan, Clinton, Bush, Obama, all these neoliberal reforms that have been embraced by four decades of presidents of both parties and Congress, not to mention, by the way. And millennials and Zoomers are increasingly the ones who are speaking out against neoliberalism. And God bless them for it, because, if we don't stop neoliberalism, we're going to end up like Russia. We're going to end up, Russia is the end point of neoliberalism. And, basically an oligarchy with a strongman leader. And it's not a road that I think we want to go down. And I think the generations that are the most aware of this crisis and of these difficulties, I mean, boomers like myself can look back and say, oh yeah, we can see it. We can see this arc of history. Back in the day when I was going to school, you could pay for yourself washing dishes. We get it. But it's not in my face, because I've had 50 years in the marketplace and done okay by myself. But for somebody just starting out, in an America where union jobs are hard to find and where it's almost impossible to start an entrepreneurial business. I've started 7 businesses in my life. 5 of them were pretty successful. 3 of them were really successful, and you can't do that anymore. Because another one of the neoliberal reforms that Reagan introduced was in 1983, when he ordered the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice to stop enforcing the antitrust laws. And that kicked off that, roaring 80s, M&A merger era where Michael Milken and all these guys were buying companies and jamming them together and laying off people and robbing the pension funds and destroying unions and everything else. And now it's, it used to be people would start a business and it would, they'd pass it down in their families. You could visit any city in America and know where you were because the local bank was named after the town or after, a family in town. The local restaurants were, the local, everything was locally owned. Now nothing's locally owned. And, because of these neoliberal reforms. So, I totally get it. And I really believe that the hope for the future of this country right now is in the hands of basically these 2 generations that are coming up, the millennials and the Zoomers.
Well, thank you very much, Thom. I think that's a good point to end our discussion. And once again, thank you very much for being here. It's really an honor.
It's my pleasure, Andrew. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. You're welcome.